So I want to just welcome everybody to our next mini-series of the Advanced Learning Institute, again with one of our favorite teachers, Rabbi Daniel Levine. And we're going to be studying over the next 4 weeks different streams of Zionistic thought. And so relevant, always relevant, and Israel is such an important focal point of Jewish and world politics, but really to understand where we are today and how we got there is really will be buttressed and supported by some of the historical material that Daniel's going to cover for us in the next 4 weeks. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for your support for this program. And I turn it over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much. It's so nice to be back with everybody. Let me just spotlight here. So yeah, I am really excited to talk about different streams of Zionist thought. I'm hoping that one of the ways in which I want to do this over the next 4 weeks is for the first, let's say, a third to half, have it be more almost lecture based with some sources, and then really get to some conversation at the end. Because I think one of the things that I'm hoping to focus more on is ideas as opposed to history. I think some of the history is important in sort of laying down the foundations and trying to figure out, it's not like, let's say Herzl woke up one morning and, had this incredible idea to return to an ancient homeland, right? There was obviously a lot of history, both ancient and modern, that buttress that. But it's really these ideas that are living on that even to understand the contemporary Jewish world or the contemporary Israeli political sphere, the ideas have sort of withstood the test of time, so to speak. And so obviously the challenges that the Jewish community was facing in the late 1800s, early 1900s are very different in terms of their details as we're facing in the 21st century. The mainstream ideological gaps actually have a lot of really interesting parallels. So I'm definitely excited to get into a lot of that. So let me go ahead and share my screen and just give us the very quick historical background that, again, I'm more than happy to go into any more detail on, but just for people that are coming in with not a lot of background information before we even go to modernity, just to paint the sort of obvious fact that I have to say, because sadly, I think in the contemporary world, so many people want to deny this basic facet of Jewish history, is that the Jewish community, the Jewish people, really went through our initial and subsequent evolution throughout the land of Israel. And so this obviously is not a big picture Jewish history class, but if it was, we'd be spending several weeks talking about the journey to Israel, King David, King Solomon, all the different kingdoms, the split between the north and south, the Babylonian exile, the return to Israel, Jews under the Persian period, under the Greek period, the story of Hanukkah, the Roman destruction of the temple. And so there really was about 1,000+ years of the earliest days of Jewish history that was centered around a land called Israel. And this is important really for 2 reasons that I'll just say at the outset, and then I can get stuck in ancient history all day, so I'm going to very specifically not do that. But the 2 reasons why it's important is, one, we tend to have a modern bias when we are trying to label things. And so this is just, even social psychologists will tell you the way in which humans organize the world is we want to neatly categorize people, right? A negative way to say that is we want to stereotype people. And it's not always for negative reasons. A lot of times, right, our brain just can't handle the capacity of seeing every single entity in the world as individualistic. And so we tend to lump things together. Oh, those are the athletic guys, right? The jocks. Oh, those are the nerds, right? I'm giving a very banal example. And so when it comes to Judaism, people want to try to define it. Oh, is that a religion? Oh, is that a ethnicity? Oh, is that a nationality? And these are interesting academic conversations. And for today's world where we're so used to thinking of things in labels, oftentimes it might be an interesting or important exercise to say, well, Judaism is a religion with a little bit of ethnicity, or Judaism is a nationality, or all of these things. But it turns out, right, and this is sort of, by way of obvious introduction, when you go back to the ancient world, no such of those ideas apply. And so it's not even that. So a lot of people have this faulty view, and this will be the last thing that I say by ancient introduction, that a lot of Zionism is only rooted in Judaism insofar as Jews have had this religious or theological belief that God has given them the land of Israel. And that certainly exists. And I'm excited when we talk about religious Zionism, I forgot which one of the sessions, that's going to be a major cornerstone of our conversation there, of claims to politics based off of religion. But it turns out when we look at big picture Jewish history, and certainly Zionism is a political movement, there was almost very little of what we might call religion that was interwoven within an initial Zionist movement. And so we're at this sort of gulf where for all of Jewish history, there was this inextricable linkage between Judaism and Israel, not necessarily even from a religious perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a memory perspective, from a, just to give, a end of the Passover Seder and next year in Jerusalem, even though Jews that were living in, let's say, Poland had no idea what Jerusalem looked like. I mean, this was as vague of an idea as saying, I want to go to the moon, but it was still part of the culture and nomenclature that there is this place called Jerusalem in Israel, and one day we will return, even if nothing had been done in the long stretch of Jewish history to actually get there. And so there's a bit of a paradox, and this is just the last thing I'll say before we go into modernity, that the return to Israel has been a paradox throughout the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, because it's been spoken about several times a day in traditional Jewish language. And if one looks through a prayer book, let's say the traditional Jewish prayer book has dozens and dozens of prayers of wanting to return to Israel. And yet there was very little done throughout the 2,000 years of diaspora and exile to actually make that practically happen. And so we're given this tension where on the one hand, the idea of a return to Israel was ubiquitous and has been ubiquitous throughout our history. And on the other hand, that idea was almost never seen as a realistic, pragmatic idea. It was seen as almost let's wait, in some futuristic time at the end of history, or when Mashiach comes, the Messiah comes, then we'll be back in Israel. And so just by one way of illustration, if we imagine going into a time machine and, you exit in the 1600s and you're taking a tour of different Jewish communities, and you go to Hungary and Poland and Iraq and Yemen, right? Some of the main Jewish centers in the 1600s. And you tell everybody, hey, my name is Daniel. I'm from the future, right? I'm from 400 years from now. And guess what? Things are great. We have a Jewish state right now. Here is the predicament of modern Jews. About half of us live in America, half in Israel. We have our own army. We're respected on the world stage as a global superpower. They would have said, oh my goodness, Mashiach has come, right? The Messiah has come, right? For them, it was impossible to have the contemporary situation of Jewish autonomy, Jewish statehood, Jewish return to Israel, Jewish power without the Messiah having had come. And then if you told them, actually, no, sorry, you're mistaken. The Messiah hasn't come yet, right? We're still in some ways waiting for Mashiach, waiting for the Messiah. They would have thought you were lying about modern day Israel. They would have said, well, there's no chance, right? Because in the mind of Jewish tradition, and, again, if we had endless time to talk about the sort of theology of exile, to some extent, it was linked, right? If God was the one who took the Jews out of Israel, right? In the words of our prayer book, right? Because of our sins, God has exiled us from the land. It was only God who could bring us back to the land of Israel. And that basically summarizes the tension of Jewish belief towards return to the land of Israel, right? It was always a hope, a dream, a prayer, and it was always something that was metaphorically in the future in some other era, right? Never practical or tangible, right? So that's sort of the background history. So enter the Haskalah, which again, probably rivaled with the writing down of the Talmud, is the most important chapter in Jewish history. And really to understand the contemporary Jewish community requires an understanding of this period known as the Jewish Enlightenment. And again, just to paint the history, I'm going to zoom through this just because I really want to get to discuss the ideas. And so, sorry if this seems a little bit rushed, but the Haskalah was on the tails of the European Enlightenment, which of course was a time when the church and religion was losing its power over the public sphere, which on the one hand seemed like a very good thing for Jews because, for long story short, Jews under Christian rule in the Middle Ages in Europe did not fare so well, right? There was no protection, right? There was no break between church and state. And if the church thought X, Y, or Z about Jews, it's not like there was a government or political entity to protect Jews as a minority. And so the Jewish struggle in medieval Christendom was one full of suffering and persecution. And so once Christianity loses its power over the public sphere, this led to emancipation, right? All of a sudden, between the years 1770 and 1881, all of a sudden, different countries throughout Europe, countries where Jews were heavily persecuted throughout the Middle Ages, all of a sudden these Jews get, to some extent, on paper, equal rights. And this is something I've said many times before, so I don't want to harp on this, but I think, especially in today's day and age, with everything that we now understand about systems of, say, racism or systems of sexism and things like that, is just because you change the laws on the books doesn't mean you could erase systems that have been put in place for hundreds of years that block progress. And so Jews faced a very similar problem in modern or pre-modern Europe, right at the height of the Enlightenment, because there was a paradox. On the one hand, everything is equal on paper, right? No longer, if you were a Jew, you didn't have to be confined to certain areas called ghettos. You didn't have to go to only Jewish neighborhoods or Jewish schools or Jewish hospitals, right? Effectively, segregation ended. The ghetto walls were torn down, both literally and metaphorically. Now Jews were able to do whatever they wanted, right? As per the law. But of course, right, we know this story. When Jews actually started trying to actualize that right that they had, they were, of course, confronted with tons of anti-Semitism, right? Because again, you don't erase anti-Semitism throughout a culture by changing a couple laws, top down enforced. And so this created, again, a problem that, and this is just a little map of when different countries emancipated European Jewry, right? You have all these countries where on paper, right, if you were, let's say, an alien legal scholar, right? I like these weird thought experiments. If you were an alien legal scholar that had never, that didn't know anything about history, or you fed it into, a newly designed artificial intelligence that was just analyzing the legal structure, they would have said, yes, anti-Semitism in England or anti-Semitism in Germany or anti-Semitism in Italy is over, right? There is no anti-Semitism in France as per the legal code. But then, of course, you go and you experience even a day on the streets of France in the early 1800s, and anti-Semitism is rampant. And so what do you do when on paper everything is equal, but in actuality nothing is equal? And this creates a problem or a question. And so this is when we're introduced to this all-encompassing question called the Jewish question. Whenever I introduce the Jewish question, I always have to give the caveat is this was a big question that was asked both internally in the Jewish community in the early 1900s. It was also asked about the wider non-Jewish community. I'll explain what it was in 1 second, but the important caveat is today, nobody speaks about the Jewish question in contemporary settings unless they're almost certainly anti-Semitic. And so today, there's no longer this language of the Jewish question. And so if one Googles the Jewish question and sees, a modern blog post written about the Jewish question, right, you should probably be a little bit skeptical about that source. But this was a question that was alive and well. And so just to, again, paint the background, right, we have emancipation, and all of a sudden now this question had to be asked, which are, who were the Jews, right? So this is step one of the Jewish question of, again, coming into modernity, and how I introduce this idea where Jews don't fit in neatly to religion, ethnicity, or nationality all of a sudden in post-Enlightenment Europe, everybody is very obsessed with these ideas of ethnicity, of race, of nationality, of religion. And this is the first time in history where you start to see nationalism, where you start to see religion being this thing that's neatly dissected from the rest of life. And so you have these people now all of a sudden looking at Jews and they're saying, well, hey, who are you guys? Are you guys a religion? Is Judaism basically Christianity, but you don't believe in Jesus? Is Judaism actually a nationality? Is Judaism like being a Frenchman, but you guys just don't have a state yet, right? Is Judaism a nationality? Is Judaism an ethnicity? Is Judaism perhaps a race, right? I don't get it, right? What are you, right? In the most basic sense. And this wasn't just a question asked externally. It wasn't just the wider public that was confused about who and what Jews are. Jews were confused about who and what Jews are. And I'll add, Jews are still confused about who and what Jews are because these terminologies just don't map, right? I know in my heart, or I'll use a Jewish term, I know in my neshamas or kishkas, right? Yiddish for the depth of my I think liver or something, but right, the depth of my soul, I know what a Jew is subjectively. Can I ever explain it objectively of this strange mix of culture, ethnicity, religion, nationhood, feeling like a part of a people, right? That's almost impossible to explain to wider society. And so you have all of these attempts of Jews trying to explain to the wider public who and what Jews are. And they are obviously all giving very different definition based off of what they think will keep them safer. And so if you think, right, I'll just give one or two examples and then we'll move past this to Zionism. If you think that Napoleon, right, who was of course the leader of France in, let's say, the year 1800, if you think Napoleon will make Jews safer if Jews proclaim their loyalty as Frenchmen, you are going to be more likely to define Judaism as more of a religion. Because if you define Judaism as more of a all-encompassing peoplehood, all of a sudden, if I am loyal to Jews throughout the world, that will take away from my loyalty to France, right? What happens if France goes to war with a neighboring country and there are Jews living in that other neighboring country? Will I put my loyalty to my co-French soldiers and French citizens ahead of my loyalty to Jews that are across a nation state line, right? And these are important and difficult questions. And so and this was called relatively the Jewish question. And again, you start to get all these different answers, right? Are Jews a people? Are Jews a religion that accepts the civil laws of host state? Are Jews a race? And you have all these attempts to tackle this question. And the last thing I'll say before introducing Zionism is that this question was not an interesting academic-y theoretical question. Usually today, it's the year, in the year 2023, whenever, right, this is the all-important question that every time I teach about Judaism, especially at an intro level, right, it's always the first question of what are Jews or who are Jews? And usually today it's 80%, an interesting intellectual exercise, maybe 20% practical to try to understand, why do a lot of Jews see Zionism as an inherent part of Judaism? Why can you also be an atheist and a Jew, right? So it's somewhat pragmatic, but mostly it's just interesting background and philosophical. In the year 1800, this was a very practical question because Jews were making the argument to the wider public why they should be accepted. And a lot of people, right, were looking back on Jews and were saying, we don't even know what you are, right? You've been othered for about 1800 years in Europe to some extent, right? How do we know that you are going to be a part of wider society? How do we know you're going to be a loyal Frenchman? If you were a communist or socialist, how do we know you're going to be a part of the revolution? If you are an American, right? Louis Brandeis actually wrote a book trying to respond to this question. He wrote The Jewish Problem and How to Solve It. How do we know that Jews are going to be liberal Democrats and not a part of, again, any other definition that's going to put them apart from the public? And so over the course of the 1800s, you have about 100 years of Jews trying to answer this question and trying to define Judaism in every which way, right? Some Jewish thinkers define Judaism as just a religion. Some defined it as an ethnicity/race almost. Some define Judaism as a culture or an idea. Some define Judaism as a obsolete religion that now should best just be assimilated back into mainstream European culture, right? You had every single answer possible. And this was more an attempt to tell the wider public, we can be whatever you want us to be. We just want to be treated as equals. And you had Jews, of course, across the entire social spectrum. So at this point, you still had ultra-Orthodox Jews who were maintaining a very religious and segregated from wider society way of life. You had Jews that were joining the socialistic and communistic movements. You had Jews that were becoming liberal Democrats. You had Jews that were becoming capitalists, right? Jews were not one thing throughout Europe in the 1800s. It's almost an obvious statement, but it bears mentioning. And Jews were, again, different Jewish thinkers were trying to solve this Jewish question of who are the Jews and how do we keep ourselves safe? And throughout the 1800s, that this question was ubiquitous throughout Jewish circles in Europe. What do you know? Anti-Semitism wasn't getting better, as you would have thought if you were a pundit in the year 1800 in any European country, and somebody said, in 100 years from now, is anti-Semitism going to be better or worse? You almost certainly would have said better, right? One, because things were looking optimistic, and it seemed like everything was going well, right? Emancipation was happening, right? The wider public was starting to try to get to know these people called Jews. But what do you know? Throughout the 1800s, anti-Semitism gets increasingly worse. You have a series of pogroms that take place in Eastern Europe. You have the Dreyfus affairs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And you have the Protocols of Elders of Zion, which was this extremely anti-Semitic forged book that was spreading throughout Europe at the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Jewish thinkers were sitting around and they were saying, oh my goodness, right? It seemed, or some Jewish thinkers were sitting around saying, it seems like all of these attempts at a solution have just not worked, right? Jews have attempted to become good comrades in the socialistic or communistic fight. Well, what do you know, right? A lot of communistic movements contain a lot of anti-Semitism. Jews have tried to become loyal nationalist figures of Germany, of France, of all these countries. What do you know? When something like the Dreyfus affairs happens, it seems like the whole country turns against the Jews and there are mobs in the streets of Paris yelling death to Jews. And over again, you see a sort of a brokenness from starting off very narrow, but starting to increase that will introduce a Zionism in 1 second. Just to paint one more part of the history, and then we can get into some of the ideas, is so towards the end of this era, in the year 1881, there was a series of extremely tough anti-Semitic pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. And this is well known for scholars of American history because most American Jews, or probably the bulk of American Jews, actually immigrated between 1880 and 1920 from Eastern Europe to America. That was sort of the major immigration of European Jews to America. But a small group dubbed themselves the Chovevei Zion, or the lovers of Zion, and they started going to the land of Israel or to Palestine, and they started setting up settlements all across the country. Now, it bears mentioning a couple important things. This was an apolitical movement. And what I mean by apolitical was that there was no assumption or no understanding that there would be any type of political autonomy or statehood, right? To some extent, we might even say this movement did not have a centralized mission. It was based on the belief that Europe is becoming too anti-Semitic. For whatever reason, either you weren't rich enough or you were too scared to go to America, or maybe based off of a lot of these people came from very religious backgrounds, right? You wanted the chance to see the Holy Land, right? Let's go to Israel and let's become pioneers and try to begin to work the land. But again, there was no centralizing principle behind this. And there was only about 30,000 Jews from Russia. Several other thousand Jews joined from Yemen. Again, them almost certainly this was based off of messianic assumptions of, again, in the end of days, Israel is where the Messiah is going to come and where all the Jews are going to return. And so they wanted to be at the forefront of that movement. Just one name to associate with this movement is Leon Pinsker, just in case people are looking at it. And the big mission was to build up settlements in the land of Israel through agriculture. We'll get back to agriculture in a minute. And again, this was an apolitical movement. So the Chovevei Zion, a lot of people say it was a precursor to Zionism, Some might call it proto-Zionism. Again, you can use whatever term you want. But there was a movement before Herzl was even on the stage as a Zionist thinker of the first Aliyah and of setting up a lot of the earliest settlements or cities in Israel, If you've ever been to the town, let's say Zichron Yaakov or Rishon LeZion, Rishon LeZion literally means in Hebrew, the first to Zion. And so this was, again, of course, the first city that was set up, This was a movement that was happening. So you already start to see anti-Semitism driving some Jews to the land of Israel, but this is hardly a centralized or political movement, certainly not an international political movement. One other interesting point just to put here is there was a young, I think he was in his mid-20s, a man named Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who he's not just known for having a lot of streets in Israel named after him. He's known for the person who revived the Hebrew language. And he was one of these young Allahs, one of these young people who went up on these immigrations to Israel. And he wrote, and I actually wanted to show one quote. So I'm going to exit this. We don't have enough time to fully get into this, but I'm actually happy to share these resources with anybody after. But writing in the year 1880, so right before even the first Aliyah, Ben Yehuda already starts to set some ideology of Zionism in place. And he writes as follows: "Will our language and literature last much longer if we don't revive it, if we do not make it a spoken language? And how can that work other than by making Hebrew the instructional medium of our schools? Not in Europe, not in any of the lands of our exile where we are insignificant minority, and no amount of teaching effort is going to succeed, but in our own land, the land of Israel." So this is an incredible paragraph for a couple reasons. One, because in the year 1880, there was nothing in Israel. First of all, I mean, there was, maybe a couple thousand ultra-Orthodox Jews that were around, living mostly in Jerusalem and the north and the Galilee, maybe in cities like Tzfat. But there was hardly any infrastructure of coming up with a new culture and new idea. Second of all, Herzl, writing in the year 1896, so this is 15 years later, when he's describing what he wants for the future state of Israel, he has a couple lines where he flippantly says, well, of course, the language of Israel is going to be Yiddish. Yiddish is the language that Jews speak. Of course, this is just Ashkenazi Jews, but Herzl was quite a Eurocentrist. Can somebody even imagine how ridiculous it would be to think that somebody could order a cup of coffee in Hebrew, This is Herzl writing 15 years later, because for over 2,000 years, no Jew had spoken Hebrew, Hebrew was the language of the Torah, the language that we pray in, the language that, some religious debates are written in, but there was not a spoken language in 2,000 years. And so this idea already of Eliezer Ben Yehuda trying to think that he could revive Hebrew isn't just an interesting historical tidbit. It gets at the beginning of an ideology, And now we're getting into discussing ideas a little bit. It gets into the idea of an ideology that Israel, one, is based off of this paradoxical mix of old and new, You take this old language that hasn't been used in 2,000 years and you make it new again, You revive it, It's not the language of creation. It's the language of renewal, which is crucial to understanding the psyche of Zionism and modern day Israel. And even I think what's so much, this is just a tangential aside, but what so much of the international community misunderstands about Zionism in Israel is, for many, the Jews have arrived, or the Jews have come to Israel, In more nefarious language, the Jews have taken Israel, in Jewish language, right? I'm not saying every Jew, but just, again, if somebody wakes me up in the middle of the night and says, give me one sentence of the history of Zionism, in my mind, in my, half sleepless state, I'll say Zionism is when the Jews returned to Israel. And the verbiage is key there, right? Is Zionism a return to Israel, or is Zionism a coming to Israel? And in the language of the Zionists, and I would argue 90 whatever percent of Jews today, Zionism is a return. And so the metaphor of reviving Hebrew is part of this, of saying, one, what we're doing is based off of our ancient heritage, right? Hebrew was the language that was spoken 2,600 years ago, therefore I want to revive it. And two, and we'll get into this point in a couple minutes, because this is one of the most interesting points about this early chapter of Zionism, what we'll call labor Zionism or political Zionism, is it was also, in so much as it was based off of a looking back towards history and trying to renew it, it was also based off of a rejection of exile. And I don't mean a rejection of exile just saying that, hey, Maddie, you probably shouldn't live in Southern California, right? You should live in Israel, right? Not that rejection of exile. A rejection of exile was seen as an insignificant mistake in Jewish history, and it was a mess to be cleaned up as opposed to a journey to be valued. And we'll get to that in a little bit, but I think this is one of the most important pieces to understand of early Zionism. I think also, I think we can either get into this later today or one of the next weeks. I think this one piece is also responsible for the misunderstanding, right? I'm going to use a very low stakes word, but I can use a much stronger word. The misunderstanding between American Jews and Israeli Jews, is this language of exile, generally, and this is going to be a huge stereotype and generalization, but generally Jews that are living in the diaspora value the diasporic tradition a lot more than Jews living in Israel, who view the diasporic tradition. And when I say diasporic tradition, I mean the legacy of the Talmud, the legacy of our medieval debates, the legacy of the ethical movements of the 17 and 1800s in Europe, right? Was that an insignificant mistake in Jewish history that should be cleaned up? Or is that something to value because it's a part of our heritage, right? That is going to be a huge debate. And in reviving Hebrew, to some extent, Eliezer ben Yehuda is not only saying, I want to renew the old, which we'll get back to in a few minutes. What he's saying is all of the languages of the exile are now insignificant. Yes, Yiddish has a rich culture of about 800 years. Literature, poetry, spoken word, both religious, secular literature, right? All of a sudden, Yiddish is seen as an exilic language. There will be no Yiddish in our new country, right? Of course, Yiddish is problematic for other reasons, right? No Jew coming from the Middle East or the Arab world spoke Yiddish. So from one perspective, it's a good thing, right? That Israel, from almost every perspective, it's a good thing that Israel revived Hebrew, because it was extremely Eurocentric of Herzl to think that the language in Israel would always be Yiddish, right? It cuts out about half the Jewish community. But Ben Yehuda was not necessarily interested in ensuring that Jews from Iraq would eventually be able to feel at home. He was much more interested in, again, this both renewal of the ancient and also this cleaning up of the exilic tradition, which we'll get back to in a few minutes. So in this, right, all the background, we're now introduced to Herzl, who by now, none of these facts should be surprising, that Herzl was an atheist, Herzl was an assimilationist, and Herzl was, again, somebody who didn't have much interaction with the wider Jewish community, certainly wasn't religious, right? If somebody bumped into him on the streets in his younger days, he might have said that Jews should try their best to assimilate. And towards the end of his life, he died very young, sadly, but he went through a major philosophic switch, right? The sort of lore behind it is the Dreyfus affairs, right? A lot of scholars have a more complicated picture of how exactly Herzl came to this idea. But for whatever reason, Herzl had a change of heart, thinking that no longer can Jews simply assimilate into wider Europe. Jews actually have to solve this through a political solution. And so Herzl writes this essay called A Solution of the Jewish Question, where he writes as follows. As you want to see, Maddie, can I ask you to read this?
Yes, sorry, I had to like scroll. Okay. The Jewish question still exists. Wait, sorry, all of it?
Yes.
Okay. The Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It is a remnant of the Middle Ages, which civilized nations do not even yet seem able to shake off, try as they will. They certainly showed a They certainly showed a generous desire to do so when they emancipated us. The Jewish question exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not exist, it is carried by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. This is the case in every country and will remain so, even in those highly civilized, for instance, France, until the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America. I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one, even though it sometimes takes these and other forms. It is a national question, and to solve it, we must first of all establish it as an international political problem to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the world in council.
Cool. I'm going to pause you for 1 second. So just to summarize here, so Herzl's saying two important things that get at the root of a political Zionist thought. One, this idea that the Jewish question has not been solved, right? That you think that anti-Semitism is getting better. You think that the place of Jewish life in the diaspora is getting better, but that's a fallacy, right? According to Herzl, right? Everything I'm saying now, right? I may or may not agree with it, but I'm presenting the world according to political Zionism. So that's just an important disclaimer here. Happy to share personal opinions anytime after. So Herzl says, right, don't fool yourself into thinking that Jews are going to solve this existential question of them fitting into wider society anywhere. Even the Jews who are now running off to America, right, as Herzl's writing this in 1896, this is during the major waves of immigration to America, and Herzl saying, right, don't delude yourself into thinking that running off into England and America and these countries that, right, America does have this exceptionalistic promise to Jews, right? America doesn't have the same ancient or historical anti-Semitism as Europe. Herzl saying you're just kidding yourself, right? There's something about Jews, right? This is a existentialist or categorical statement to Herzl almost, right? It's become a dogma, and it's become a dogma that continues to become a dogma of Zionism. Again, whether we buy into this dogma or not, right? And you know, it could also be more complicated than is this true or false? But to Herzl, at a certain point, there was nothing that could be done to solve the Jewish question in diaspora. And he has this interesting line that Maddie just read, I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one. So he's saying all attempts to solve this problem with either sociology or religiousness are going to fail. What does he mean by that? The Reform movement tried to solve the Jewish question through a religious solution, right? In the year 1885, just to give some history, the Pittsburgh Platform in America says, Jews are no longer a people, we're a religion. We don't want to return to a homeland. We don't believe in the rebuilding of the temple. And this is both an interesting theological statement of the Reform movement. It's also an attempt to solve the Jewish question. It's an attempt for Jews that are now in America looking around and saying, guys, this is pretty great. Let's really try to not screw this up, right? Excuse my crude terminology. We want America to be, right, the safe haven for Jews. And the way to get there is for Jews to play in, let's say, the language of America, for Jews to be Americans in the streets, but Jews at home. And so, sure, what differentiates me from my Christian neighbor is we have some different holidays. Our prayers sound a little different. Maybe he's in church on Sunday and I'm in synagogue. You know, I was going to say church, on Saturday, but we're the same, right? I'm not a part of this, international peoplehood, right? Am Yisrael, or I don't want any, national solutions, right? That would be a religious solution. What would a social solution be? It would be to say, listen, these terminologies and these categories, right, are so Middle Ages, right? We are in modernity now, right, in the year 1880, 1890. The way to ensure human progress is obviously through progressive movements, right? Socialism, communism, all of these movements that acknowledge differences in people as just simply pathologies of a wider problem, right? In a Marxist view, all differences in people, be it ethnic, religious, nationalistic, can be reduced to economic strife. And so if Jews join the Marxist revolution, and again, this was quite a palatable view, right? I think, today when we think of Marxism and communism, we're sort of marred by what happened in the late 20th century, which of course is all taken, but this is the late 1800s at this point. And so a lot of Jews said, well, if we join into these revolutions, we'll be seen as equals, because everybody in Marxist circles understands that a religious or nationalistic or ethnic identity is sort of secondary to the real purpose, which is you have the capitalists and you have the proletariats. And, if we just join this, we can also, right, create, for lack of a better term, a new world in which there's no racism, no anti-Semitism, right? Imagine there's no heaven, right? To quote a famous song, right? And if Jews can just convince the rest of the world that none of these things matter, right? That the only thing that matters is a lot of these grand ideas of equality and all of these things, again, whether through economic movements such as Marxism or socialism, or through progressive movements such as, let's just try to convince everybody in the world to become liberals, right? What's a liberal? Sure, we might be different, but everybody gets the same basic and individualistic rights, right? This is a great idea. I think most people are for it, but Herzl's saying, don't even think that idea is going to save you, right? So he discredits, right? And basically he's categorically rejecting all attempts to solve the Jewish question through any medium that's not political, right? This is why Herzl has thought of founding political Zionism. Maddie, sorry to cut you off. Go for it.
No, you're good. We are a people, one people. We've sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in this country. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has endured such struggles and sufferings as we have. Jew baiting has merely winnowed out our weaklings. The strong among us defiantly return to their own whenever persecution breaks out.
Thank you, Maddie. So just one more thing to add. So of course, Herzl's answer is, what is the solution? It has to be a political solution, right? This is a political problem, so it needs a political solution, right? That is one of Herzl's premises. And again, based off of this rejection of not just Jews in the diaspora, but politics in the diaspora, right? This is the beginning of, right, to quote another early political Zionist thinker, right? Political Zionism is simply the belief that we can no longer trust Goyim to be in charge of us, right? And to protect us, right? Throw everything else out to some extent is what Herzl's saying, even to the point, right? This is probably not news to a lot of people, but Herzl accepted different plans, right? Again, I don't want to go too much into history, but at one point in the early 1900s, Herzl was offered Uganda by the British government to be a Jewish state. And Herzl said yes, because for Herzl, this was just about a political solution to keep Jews safe, right? And again, we already noted that Herzl was an assimilationist and an atheist, right? Didn't have much to do with Judaism. And so for Herzl, right, to some extent, who cares where this place is? It just needs to be somewhere, right? There just needs to be some place in which we can solve the Jewish question through Jewish political control, right? And to some extent, right, and one other point, right, because I'm sort of debating this in my head, when I'm using the term exile according to Herzl, to some extent, the definition of exile here might not even be living outside the land of Israel. It might be the exile of living outside of a Jewishly politically controlled area, right? And those are important nuances of difference, right? Herzl thought, right, and it is still the belief, I would argue, of many Zionists today, right? Again, not a normative statement, a descriptive statement, that Jews simply are unsafe in places that do not have a Jewish government and Jewish control of power. And even if, let's say, things are going great for American Jews in 2023, well, it's only a matter of time. It's only till the next election. It's only till the next civil unrest. It's only till the next whatever that it can all change in a heartbeat, right? According to the, political Zionist worldview. And then you're going to need a place that, Jews are in control of autonomy and all of these things. And you're going to be very happy that it's there. And so again, this political Zionism is a rejection of diaspora. And I'll take your question in 1 second. A rejection of any solution to the Jewish question that doesn't involve politics. And when I say politics, I don't just mean, the banality of politics. When I say politics, I mean government and army and all of these things that are really behind what we mean when we say politics. And that this is basically a fact that is going to be true for all time. Sheila, go for it.
I think we also have to include education in this, as far as what's being said and perpetuated. Going back, I lived in Israel from 2013 to 2015. When I came back to UCI, I Hate Israel Week. And they were producing a solo show in the theater department called My Name is Rachel Corey. Do you know that story, Daniel?
No.
So Rachel Corey was a college student who was incentivized to go and fight in Gaza in 2005. We know in the uprising, and on behalf of the Palestinians. And she stood in front with a Palestinian flag of an IDF tank and was run over. And she became a martyr. And UCI produced this with no counter narrative, with no anything. And it led the students and the audience, and it was part of I Hate Israel Week, to believe. And here, literally 3 days before I'd gotten off a plane, we had just gone through when the 3 young men had been, kidnapped and murdered. How do we look at this essay, we look at the political connotations and ramifications, but if this is still being, sanctioned on university campuses and to support Israel is considered the liberal agenda, how do we even begin to respond? And what responsibility?
You're not going to like my answer, so I'm going to preface my answer by
I want to understand. It's not whether I like it or
no.
not.
So I say that a little bit in jest because I'm going to answer I'm going to pretend that I'm Herzl giving you that answer.
Okay,
not me. Herzl would say, you're right. It's a worthless endeavor. Give up, move to Israel. Right. Like that, right. Which is sort of the whole point that I'm trying to get across. Right. I don't say that to be like crude. Herzl believed that was a futile effort, that Jews had tried to do that, and that any amount of explaining or rationalization or, if we could only show them this, if I could only show, the non-Jewish public, that Jews are like everybody else, that, we also want to go home and eat dinner and be safe in our beds, right? If we could only convince that, right? I personally don't think this is futile, right? I'm just going to say that as a preface. I don't want to be misquoted, but from to some extent, a reductionary, some view of Herzl would say that's the reason for political Zionism, because this effort is just a futile effort. And so Herzl would look right now at a lot of the anti-Zionism that's around the world stage, right? Whether it's the UN or whether it's, coming out of, far left progressive movements. And he would almost say he would be surprised if that didn't happen to some extent. And so I I think it's interesting. And when we get into other sort of stages of Zionism, we'll sort of see how that comes across in other stages. But for Herzl, I think it would have been a given that, you sort of don't worry about it to some extent. Right. As strange as that sounds. Yeah, it is a really good question. Just to introduce one more piece of Herzl, I don't actually know if this ends at 10:30 or 11, so I'll probably split the difference and we can go to like 10:45. Just to right, Herzl actually wrote one other book that's absolutely fascinating. So I just wanted to give one excerpt. And his book is called The Alt-Neuland, or Old New Land. This is actually the background for the city of Tel Aviv, right? Tel Aviv in Hebrew literally means the old new, right? A tel in Hebrew is an ancient archaeological site. Aviv is the Hebrew word for springtime, right? A word that represents newness. So Tel Aviv means the old new. And Herzl's book was called Old New Land, or Alt-Neuland in Yiddish. And again, even this paradox of Tel Aviv, or old new, gets at a lot of what we were talking about before, that this was a old movement that was trying to be all about renewal. And I won't even go over this quote. People could read it, but this is a novel. So what's interesting about this book is, unlike Herzl's first manifesto, which is really a political manifesto of trying to explain how Zionism will work and politics of it and behind it, now Herzl is sort of, I guess, dipping into his creative side, and he's writing a novel of a skeptical European who comes to Palestine in the early 1900s. The land is devoid of anything, right? There's swamps, right? It's inhospitable to living. And this person is highly skeptical of there ever being able to be a Jewish state. And then, right, I'm giving a gross summary here, right? He leaves for about 20 years. He comes back. When he comes back in the year 1920, there's already a beautiful state set up. Jews and Arabs have peace, right? Everything is sort of this incredible utopia. Actually, one of the funny things about Old New Land, right? Herzl's writing this in 1902. Does anybody want to guess who the villain of, or the chief antagonist of this book? Who would you guess who it was? I would love to hear some guesses. Again, Herzl's writing this in 1902. This is before any real political infrastructure happening in the land of Israel. This is Herzl's futuristic projection in novel form of what he might want a state to look like. Nobody wants their guesses to be on Facebook Live here. Okay, so the chief antagonist.
Can I?
Oh yeah, go for it.
I'm going to guess. It's a religious Jew.
Yes, I love it. Thank you. Spot on. So the antagonist of Herzl's book is a rabbi who is trying to mess up relations between Jews and Arabs. And right, for anybody who hasn't read this book, it's a very short book and it's an incredible read just to get at sort of Herzl's psyche. But again, what Herzl was imagining, right? He was not imagining any religiosity in the state, right? Jews and Arabs, of course, are going to be able to get along, right? This is also before early waves of Arab nationalism, right? Of course, Jews are going to show up, right? And again, this is a very overly, right, simplistic view. Again, I'm describing Herzl's view. I'm giving a normative worth to it. Jews are going to show up. They're going to build up the infrastructure of the land. They're going to drain the swamps. They're going to set up modern medical systems. They're going to set up railways. Alt New Land also describes a desalination plant for the Dead Sea. So Jews are going to find a way to desalinate the saltiest body of water on earth, because of course we're going to be able to do it. And everything is going to be incredible. The local indigenous Arab population there is going to see how wonderful this is. They are going to team along. Everything's going to be wonderful. There's, of course, not going to be any war in the Middle East. And then once things are perfect, other religious Jews who are all against Zionism in the beginning are going to realize, hey, it seems pretty great over there. They're going to come. They're going to try to screw it up, and we're not going to let them, right? That's basically a summary of the book. Right, he goes into more details, but that was Herzl's vision, right? Based off of, again, he had his philosophy that we described before, and this is really what Herzl wanted for the state, right? He wanted a primarily secular Jewish state that was going to, right? One of the things that Herzl didn't do is neatly define exactly what the exact political entities, right? Herzl wasn't in, stage 2 Zionistic planning, right? He wasn't drawing up plans for, how is Congress going to look, and is there going to be a constitution, and all of the questions that plague modern day Israel, right? Herzl was, at least at this point, he was very much in the futuristic theoretical. But this book, of course, becomes the inspiration for Tel Aviv and so much of the newness of Israel. And it is just interesting to think 120 years ago of who he thought would be the good guys, who he thought would be the bad guys, what might be the problems. So I wanted to do just one more slide. I know that it's 10:30, so I don't know if people have to leave at 10:30, but this will be recorded for anyone who leaves the last couple of minutes. But we went into this idea a little bit before, but I just want it to bear repeating, because I think we'll come back to this theme a lot over the next couple of weeks, that tangential to the first Zionist Congress, which Herzl set up, right? Again, based off of Herzl's philosophy. Again, I'm not trying to go into the history. If we were, right, there were all these conferences that Herzl set up, and he was now trying to lobby governments in light of his philosophy. But these are things that, we can easily Google and read the Wikipedia pages on, right? I'm trying to really focus on ideas here. Tangential to all of these ideas were this idea of the creation of the new Jew. And this was an idea that's ubiquitous throughout the early political Zionist, or what eventually would become labor Zionist stages. There's a term called muscular Jew that was coined by Max Nordau, right? This is a nice picture of him. I included it because Herzl wasn't the only early 1900s Zionist with an awesome beard. So I just wanted to show one other picture. And what is this idea? Give me one second. What was this idea of the muscular Jew? And so this was an attempt, again, to reimagine Jews, right? Not to harp on stereotypes, but they were extremely stereotypical in terms of what Max Nordau and his ilk thought of diasporic Jews. The vision of diasporic Jews were a bunch of feeble, old men, right? Again, this was all thought of in very masculine terms, was a bunch of feeble old men with sort of hunchbacks looking over pages of Talmud and, sounding like the most stereotypical nerds you could ever imagine, right? A bunch of geeks. And the picture of the diasporic Jew were a bunch of people that, again, they were poor, they weren't strong, right? They were bookworms to some extent, and right, not to harp on stereotypes, but a lot of the themes were at least true, right? If you were, right, the masculine image of a Jewish leader in Jewish circles in the diaspora for most of Jewish history was not seen as, you imagine, like a Greek hero and a Roman hero, these strong men that are sitting there with armor protecting the city. The strong masculine image for diasporic Judaism were the rabbis, right? The rabbis are a bunch of people who sit around, who know texts, who have their head in the books, who are legal scholars, right? And this is a very real image, right? And there's a lot been written on, there's a lot of really interesting imagery of, Jewish masculine heroism, and, right, we can of course do the same thing for females here. But the image of the diasporic Jew was a Jewish bookworm. And one of the main fundaments of early Zionism was to erase that symbol, was to say, right, in line of their rejection of the diaspora was also a rejection of the diasporic symbol, right? According to Max Nordau, right, again, from his perspective, Jews were not meant to be people who sit around in the Beit Midrash, right, the study house, sitting around arguing about the minutia of whether or not my spoon, which I usually use for coffee with milk that I accidentally dipped into my meat cholent, whether or not I have to throw that out or bury it or kosher it, right? That was not what Jews were, that was not the legacy. Jews were supposed to be like, you open the Bible, the stories of King David and Joshua and Solomon and these heroic figures, Samson, right? These heroic figures that are coming in and doing battle and leading wars and building and planting and all of that, right? All of this imagery of the diaspora was considered, right, almost anathema to the figure of the new Jew, even to the point, right? I think this is a bullet point later, but it just bears mentioning. Someone mentioned the education curriculum in America, the education curriculum in Israel, and I make this point a lot. if you look at what, from the outset of Zionism, what they focus on in the Israeli educational system, it's stories of Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible, not stories of the Talmud, not stories of the medieval debates, not stories of halacha, of Jewish discussion, right? It's stories of, these are times where Jews are working the land and going to war and all of these things, right? The Talmud and everything else, right? Yeah, maybe we'll read about that in a museum one day, but that's not the important thing. And so, of course, one of the most interesting things that happened in this early stages of Zionism, and so this is why I really wanted to get to this point, is there was a need to reclaim Jewish figures and symbols. Because what do you know, when you look around the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, and your portrayal of the ideal type, right? The ideal type of Judaism. And by the way, at this point, it's not just the ideal masculine type, because a lot of early labor Zionism, right, didn't have, they had very egalitarian views of male and female. And so all of a sudden, right, in diasporic Jewry, it was a very, strong separation between what a woman was expected to do, what a man was expected to do, both in the minds of early Zionists, very feeble and weak, right? The man was supposed to sit around and, learn text all day. And the woman was supposed to, of course, typical gender roles, do laundry and bake challah and raise a bunch of kids. All of a sudden now, both men and women should be out in the fields, working the farmland. They should be learning how to shoot, right? They should be learning how to form a militia, right? There was no difference in the early kibbutzim where this was practiced between male and female. Everybody was expected to do everything. And this required, of course, a reclaiming of Jewish symbols. And so you get these three particular episodes, right? And I'll just spend 30 seconds on each of these, the Maccabees, Masada, and Bar Kokhba, three symbols and stories from our history that from the traditional Jewish perspective, and when I say traditional Jewish perspective, I mean the mainstream perspective that was around for the last 2,000 years, these were all terrible episodes in our history, right? We'll start with the Maccabees, which is probably the most complicated because everybody's, knows the story of Hanukkah as this lovely story. The story of Hanukkah was heavily censored by the rabbis to not be a story of militant conquest, but to be a story of God's miracles in the world. But if you actually, right, there's a reason why the book of Maccabees never made it into the Tanakh, right? If anybody's curious, just read the books of Maccabees. And it's this story of this band of militias that maybe initially had a just mission of trying to fight back the Greeks, but then eventually started killing fellow Jews, and then eventually went on conquests. And this was actually the only time in Jewish history that Jews were forcibly converting other people to Judaism, right? The episode of the Maccabees in our history was considered so toxic that actually the rabbis in the Talmud never mention the Maccabees. They're just not there, right? It's a religious censorship. There's no tractate of the Talmud called Hanukkah. There's no mention of the Maccabees and their militancy, right? In the entirety, really, of the diasporic tradition. All of a sudden, early Zionism saying, well, who are these strong, heroic Jewish characters that we can model the new Jew after? Well, hey, the Maccabees seem like great examples. Let's go and name every single Jewish sports team that's going to exist in Israel, the Maccabees, and that will reclaim, right? That's a little bit of a facetious joke, but right, let's try to, again, reclaim this symbol. And so now, there's an international Jewish sports thing every year called the Maccabiyah, right? It seems like half the teams in Israel are named, Maccabi Tel Aviv, Maccabi whatever, right? And the Maccabees have been effectively reclaimed as a symbol of not these unethical characters that the rabbis in the Talmud or the diasporic tradition sees as a sad blimp in Jewish history. The Maccabees are now these strong heroes that we want to mold ourselves after, right? The same thing could be said about Masada and Bar Kokhba. Masada was the last stand of the Jewish rebels in the year 73 CE. And this was a band of really extremists that would not make peace with the Roman Empire so much that they actually forced the war that led to the destruction of the temple. And the Talmud depicts the zealots, who were the people of Masada, as basically evil to some extent. The Talmud describes how they would go around and they would almost, their nickname were the dagger men, because they would go around Jerusalem in the year 68 CE, and any Jew that was living in Jerusalem that wanted to try to engage in diplomacy with the Roman Empire. Instead of just fighting in an all-out war, they would stab. And eventually these people all went to Masada, right? Masada is a fortress by the Dead Sea in Israel, right? It's one of the, again, landmark tourist areas in Israel, right? You'll see the connection in a second. And as the Romans sieged Masada for several months or years, I'm forgetting the exact details, they engaged in a mass suicide because they wrote, it's better that we kill ourselves than ever fall into the control of the Roman Empire. Now, right, don't read too much into the statement. Jewish tradition, right, hates the Zealots. Jewish tradition is extremely against suicide also, right? And so the Zealots and Masada was depicted as, you know, a completely, right, neutral to highly negative symbol. All of a sudden, early Zionism reclaims Masada as not this unethical choice that might have really hurt Judaism in the first century, but as this strong stand, right? The idea of Masada lo kipal, right? Masada will not fall again, as saying, you know, there was one time where the Jews were not strong enough to withstand the Roman siege. We will not let that happen again. Masada is now reclaimed as a national symbol, to the point where it's incredible, because I you know, take students to Israel all the time. And it's funny because, you know, you always get different tour guides, and some of the tour guides on Masada are totally bought into this, right? And I'm going to use the word propaganda, not propaganda is not all negative, right? Propaganda is just, you know, trying to very much get a point across. So some tour guides have completely bought into the propaganda, and their story of Masada is heavily colored by the Israel propaganda of Masada being this incredible moment of Jewish fortitude. And other tour guides, ironically, the tour guides that actually come from more religious Jewish backgrounds, talk about Masada a lot more of, yeah, you know, this really, you know, questionable thing happened, and, you know, Jewish tradition, right, doesn't love this, but it's an interesting historical episode, so that's why we're here. And then the last one, right, you know, people can read more about it, but Bar Kokhba is the same, right? In the 2nd century, the leader that led the revolt, against the Roman Empire, this was the last attempt of Jewish autonomy. I think it was in the year 137, give or take 10 years. And the Bar Kokhba revolt utterly failed and was actually terrible for Jews. And we'll be done in 3 minutes for those. I just got a message about timing here. I'll figure out if this actually ends at 10:30 or 11, because right, just one story about Bar Kokhba, because I think it's interesting, is the holiday of Lag BaOmer, which we actually just celebrated a week and a half ago. If you ask let's say an American Jew or a traditional diasporic Jew what Lag BaOmer is a day that celebrates Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was the 2nd century Kabbalist, who was thought by Jewish tradition to have come up with Kabbalah and the Zohar and all of these ideas. In Israel, Lag BaOmer is a holiday that revolves around Bar Kokhba and militancy. And so again, the same holiday that's just viewed as two completely different lights. And this, of course, went with the looking down on diasporic Jews as weak and feeble, because again, the mind of the early Zionists, it's not just diasporic Jews historically were these weak, feeble bookworms. American Jews, right? Us, me, are these weak, feeble people who don't really understand what it's like to be at war or to work the land. And I can come up with as many lofty ideas and ethics and philosophies as I want. At the end of the day, you still have that diasporic mindset, right? No matter what, I am a product of the diaspora. And unless I relinquish my diasporic self and move to Israel and do what real Jews should do, right? I'm obviously saying this facetiously, right? Do what real Jews should do, or the new Jews should do, right? I am forever going to be tainted by this mindset. And therefore, right, either my opinion is less valid or I'm going to be endlessly looked down upon. And so again, the diasporic Jewry and the diasporic Jewish tradition was maligned, right? And again, today in Israel, right, I'm of course not making the claim that every single Israeli, right? I think this all goes without mentioning, right? These are major trends, and a lot of this, even in the last 120 years, has calmed down a bit, because Israel now is much more religious of a country than the political Zionists imagine. And you had, you know, now Israel's 50% Mizrahi Jew, who I think really hurt these categories in terms of being so simple and black and white, because Mizrahi Jews were always sort of, I'll say, less bookworm and nerdy than Ashkenazi Jews. I know that's a heavy stereotype, but again, we're dealing with sort of motifs and symbols here. And they came in, but they were also much more religious. And so a lot of these categories get blurred in the mid 20th century. But at least initially, there was a complete looking down on diasporic Jews, on diasporic Jewish tradition, right? Just this will be the second to last point I make, and then I'll conclude. Even to the extent where the Jewish holidays, right, in the kibbutz movement, the Jewish holidays, right, and this is something that, for people who have a cursory knowledge of the Jewish calendar, so our three main pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, all have dual meanings, right? They're both agricultural holidays because in ancient Israelite society, it was an agrarian calendar. So they're all having to do with different parts of the harvest or the agrarian cycle. And they also have historical meanings, right? Sukkot is the traveling throughout the desert. Passover is the exodus from Egypt. Shavuot is the receival of the Torah. So of course, early Zionists only focused on the agricultural, right? That part's right, taken for granted, right? Of course, the holiday of Shavuot, which is going to be this Thursday night, right? In the early kibbutz movement, nobody sat around saying, oh my goodness, this is the day God gave us the Torah. Many of them don't believe in God and they don't care about a fictional character giving a book that they think is, anachronistic in a lot of ways. This is the Jewish festival of gathering and the harvest and everything like that. But what's more interesting about the kibbutz movement is we also have some holidays in the Jewish calendar that are purely religious or theological and not part of the agricultural cycle. Those two holidays happen to be the most two important holidays to American Jews, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? The day in which the synagogues are the most packed, the day in which your average American Jew is most likely to be in synagogue and take off work and engage in Jewish religious introspection. Guess what in the early kibbutzim they did on Yom Kippur? Absolutely nothing. Yom Kippur, right, from early accounts of the kibbutz movement was a day just like any others, to the point where they didn't even, right, a lot of them didn't even know it was on the calendar, right? Yom Kippur was just a Tuesday, right? It was 4 days before Sukkot, right? That was its import on the calendar. And so just, again, all of these individual examples as sort of symbols of what was trying to happen. Now, again, of course, 120 years, it's different. In Israel, Yom Kippur is, of course, now a national holiday, right? Things have changed. But so much of this early Zionist or political Zionist, and just the last thing, I just put labor because a lot of people, right, this is the beginning of the labor Zionistic movement where a Jewish return to not just homeland in the physical sense, but a return to these early, either real or imagined, right? And, the difference, it could be both forms of Jewish agriculture, Jewish labor, Jewish military, Jewish fighting were both reclaimed and created by this early stages of political Zionism.
That is such an exciting session. There's so much to chew on here. I'm sort of speaking a little bit on Marcia's behalf because I don't know if she's back. I just want to tell everybody what the schedule is for the next couple of weeks. There's no class next Monday. By the way, I'm Marcia. Hello. There's no class next Monday. Happy Memorial Day. On June 5th, Daniel's going to be talking about Ahad Ha'am and cultural Zionism, a state for the Jews or a Jewish state. On June 12th is revisionist Zionism, the beginning of a 100-year political battle. On June 19th is religious Zionism, when politics becomes holy. And on June 26th is Machloket Matters. Fake news or uncovering the truth. It all looks incredibly exciting. And so we're looking forward to being there with you for all of that, Rabbi Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll see you all in 2 Mondays from now.
Thank you, Marcia. I am still here. And I'll be teaching Machloket Matters. It's the last in our series. And I hope you'll all join us and tell everybody, Daniel, I think I actually couldn't leave. I was going to go do a hospital visit, but it was so great that I couldn't leave. So